The Tonight Show studio hummed with its usual Monday night energy as Michael Rodriguez walked onto the stage, his quiet composure and steady gait reflecting 20 years of remaining calm under the most intense pressure imaginable. At 52, Michael carried himself with the measured confidence of someone who had spent 2 decades being the voice of hope during people's darkest moments, his gentle eyes taking in the bright studio lights with a mixture of appreciation and slight nervousness. Jimmy Fallon stood to greet him, immediately struck by Michael's serene presence and the way he seemed to emanate a deep sense of purpose. Despite his humble demeanor, Michael wore a simple navy blue blazer over a white shirt, clothes that were clearly his best but not flashy, and carried a small leather portfolio that had obviously been handled with great care over many years. "Michael Rodriguez, everyone," Jimmy announced as the audience applauded warmly. Michael just retired after 20 years, working as a 911 emergency operator in Phoenix, Arizona. Michael, welcome to The Tonight Show. Michael settled into the guest chair with a gentle nod to the audience, his movements deliberate and calm in the way that comes from years of needing to project stability during chaos. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy. I have to say, this is definitely the most relaxed conversation I've had in a very long time. Nobody's life is hanging in the balance tonight." The audience chuckled, but there was something in Michael's tone that suggested the weight of what he had just said. Jimmy leaned forward with genuine respect and curiosity. 20 years as a 911 operator. I can't even imagine what that must have been like, Jimmy said. "You've probably heard just about every kind of emergency situation possible." Michael's expression grew thoughtful, and he placed his hands gently on the portfolio in his lap. "You know, Jimmy, most people think being a 911 operator is about collecting information quickly and dispatching the right help, and that's certainly a big part of it. But what I learned over 2 decades is that sometimes you're not just coordinating emergency response. Sometimes you're the last voice someone expects to hear or the first voice that gives them hope." "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked, sensing there was something profound behind Michael's words. Michael was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. When people call 911, they're usually in the worst moment of their lives. They're scared, they're hurt, they're desperate. And sometimes the few minutes you spend with them on the phone can be the difference between despair and hope, between giving up and holding on. The studio grew more attentive, the audience sensing they were about to hear something important. Jimmy settled back in his chair, giving Michael space to share his story. "About 7 years into the job, I got a call that changed everything for me," Michael began, his voice taking on a softer, more distant quality. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. The voice on the other end was young, maybe teenage, and he was crying. Michael's eyes grew more focused as he recalled the memory. The caller said his name was David, and he told me he was going to kill himself. He had driven to a bridge outside the city, and he was calling to say goodbye to someone, anyone, before he jumped. Jimmy felt his breath catch, understanding immediately that this wasn't going to be a typical emergency response story. "Now, protocol for suicide calls is to keep the person talking while we dispatch crisis intervention and emergency services," Michael continued, "but something about this kid's voice, something about the way he was crying told me that this wasn't just a cry for help. This was someone who had made a decision and was looking for permission to follow through with it." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word of Michael's story. "David told me he was 17, that he had been bullied at school for years, that his parents didn't understand him, that he felt completely alone in the world. He said he had been planning this for months, and he couldn't see any reason to keep living." Michael's voice remained steady, but Jimmy could see the emotion building behind his professional composure. "I stayed on the phone with David for 3 hours that night, Jimmy. 3 hours. We sent crisis counselors and police to the bridge, but David refused to come down. He said the only person he would talk to was me, the voice on the phone who had answered when he called. Jimmy leaned forward, completely absorbed in Michael's story. What did you say to him? How do you talk to someone in that situation? Michael opened his portfolio and pulled out a worn notebook. I learned that night that you don't talk someone out of suicide by giving them reasons to live. You listen to them tell you why they want to die, and then you help them find one small reason to wait just a little bit longer. He flipped through pages of careful handwriting. I asked David to tell me about his life, about the things that had brought him to this moment. And as he talked, I started to hear not just his pain, but his intelligence, his sensitivity, his capacity for caring about others. Michael's voice grew more emotional as he continued. Somewhere around hour 2, David mentioned that he had been volunteering at an animal shelter, that working with abandoned dogs was the only thing that made him feel useful anymore. That's when I knew I had found something to build on. The camera caught Jimmy wiping his eyes as he absorbed the weight of what Michael was describing. I told David about my own experiences with depression, about times when I had felt hopeless, about how sometimes the smallest acts of kindness, like caring for abandoned animals, can be signals that we still have something important to contribute to the world. Michael looked directly at Jimmy, then at the camera. By hour 3, David agreed to come down from the bridge, but only if I promised to stay on the phone with him until the crisis counselors arrived. He said my voice had become his lifeline, and he was afraid that if he hung up, he would lose his courage to keep living. The studio was completely silent, everyone absorbed in this story of human connection during the darkest possible circumstances. Did you ever find out what happened to David after that night? Jimmy asked softly. Michael smiled, and for the first time since sitting down, his expression filled with unmistakable joy. Jimmy, this is why I wanted to come on your show tonight. This is the part of the story that I think people need to hear. He reached into his portfolio and pulled out a stack of letters, all addressed in the same careful handwriting. Every year for the past 13 years, on the anniversary of that night, I receive a letter from David. He's now Dr. David Mitchell, a pediatric psychiatrist who specializes in helping teenagers with suicidal ideation. Jimmy's face lit up with amazement and emotion. Michael, are you serious? That 17-year-old kid became a doctor? Michael nodded, tears beginning to form in his eyes. Not just any doctor, Jimmy. David became the kind of doctor who saves kids like he used to be. He works at a crisis intervention center, and he uses his own experience to help other young people who feel like they have no reason to keep living. He held up one of the letters. This is from last year. David writes to tell me about the kids he's helped, about the lives he's saved, about how that night on the bridge taught him that sometimes all someone needs is one person willing to listen, really listen to their pain. Michael's voice grew stronger, more passionate. David has helped save dozens of young lives over the past decade, and it all started because he decided to make one phone call instead of jumping off a bridge. Jimmy was openly crying now, not caring about maintaining his composure on national television. Michael, do you realize what you did? You didn't just save one life that night. You saved all the lives that David has gone on to save. Michael shook his head humbly. I didn't save David, Jimmy. David saved himself. I just gave him a few hours to remember that his life had value, that his pain wasn't permanent, that there were people in the world who would miss his voice if it was gone. He pulled out another letter, this one more recent. In his most recent letter, David told me something that has stayed with me ever since I read it. He said, Michael, I want you to know that your voice didn't just save my life that night. It taught me how to be the voice that saves other lives. Every time I talk to a suicidal teenager, I try to sound like you sounded to me, calm, patient, and absolutely convinced that they matter." The audience began to applaud, but it was different from typical television applause. This was the sound of people recognizing something genuinely heroic, something that restored their faith in human compassion and the power of connection. "Have you ever met David in person?" Jimmy asked. "After all these years of letters, have you two ever actually seen each other?" Michael's expression grew bittersweet. "That's one of the most beautiful parts of this story, Jimmy. We've never met face to face. David has offered many times, and so have I, but we've both come to realize that our connection exists in a different space." He gestured toward his portfolio of letters. "Our relationship lives in words, in voices, in the space between despair and hope. David writes in one of his letters that he thinks meeting in person might somehow diminish the power of what we shared that night, the pure human connection that exists when one voice reaches out to another voice in the darkness." Jimmy leaned forward with deep fascination. "That's incredibly profound. So your relationship exists entirely through these annual letters?" Michael nodded. "And occasional phone calls when David needs to talk through a particularly difficult case. Sometimes he'll call me when he's working with a teenager who reminds him of himself, and we'll strategize together about how to reach that kid." He opened the notebook again, revealing pages of notes and observations. "Over the years, David and I have developed what we call voice protocols, ways of talking to people in crisis that focus on listening first, connecting second, and problem-solving third." Michael's voice grew more passionate as he explained. "What we learned is that most people who call 911 in crisis don't need someone to fix their problems immediately. They need someone to witness their pain, to acknowledge that their feelings are real and valid, to help them find just enough hope to make it through the next hour, the next day, the next week." Jimmy was deeply moved by the depth and thoughtfulness of Michael's approach. "Michael, it sounds like you and David have basically developed a new way of providing emergency mental health support." Michael smiled with obvious pride. "That's exactly what we've done, Jimmy. And it's being used in 9/11 dispatch centers across the country. Now David has trained crisis counselors, and I've worked with emergency dispatchers to implement techniques that focus on voice connection and deep listening." He pulled out a final document from his portfolio. "This is a letter from the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, recognizing David and me for developing what they call voice-based intervention protocols that have measurably improved outcomes for people calling in crisis." Jimmy looked at the document with amazement. "So that one phone call on a bridge 13 years ago has led to a whole new approach to suicide prevention?" "More than that," Michael replied, his voice filled with quiet awe. "David tracks the impact of his work, and between his direct interventions and the protocols we've developed together, we estimate that our techniques have been used to help save over 200 lives in the past 5 years alone." The studio fell completely silent as the magnitude of what Michael was describing settled over everyone present. Jimmy turned to address the camera directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Rodriguez didn't just answer phones for 20 years. He became a lifeline, a voice of hope, a guardian angel for people in their darkest moments." Michael looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "Jimmy, I think it's important for people to understand that what happened with David wasn't unique to me. Every 9/11 operator, every crisis counselor, every person who works in emergency services has the potential to be that voice for someone." He held up his collection of letters again. "These letters from David remind me every year that we never know when our voice, our attention, our willingness to listen might be exactly what someone needs to choose life over death, hope over despair." Jimmy leaned forward with deep respect. What would you say to people watching this who might be struggling with thoughts of suicide, or who know someone who is? Michael looked directly into the camera, his expression serious but filled with love. I would say that your voice matters, that your life has value even when it doesn't feel like it, and that there are people in this world, people like David, people like me, whose entire purpose is to remind you that you're not alone. He paused, then continued with growing passion. But more than that, I want people to understand that they have the power to be that lifeline for someone else. You don't need special training to listen to someone who's hurting. You don't need a psychology degree to tell someone that their life has value. Sometimes, all it takes is being willing to stay on the phone, to keep talking, to convince someone to wait just a little bit longer for help to arrive. The audience began to applaud again, and this time it was sustained, heartfelt recognition of both Michael's service and his message of hope. As the segment continued, Michael shared more stories from his 20 years of emergency dispatch, talking about the calls that had stayed with him, the voices that had taught him about human resilience, and the profound honor of being trusted with people's most vulnerable moments. You know, Michael told Jimmy, working in 911 dispatch teaches you that human beings are incredibly strong. People call us during the worst moments of their lives, but most of them find ways to survive, to heal, to build something meaningful from their pain. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Michael didn't immediately leave the stage. He spent another hour with Jimmy, sharing more letters from David and talking about the ongoing impact of their unusual friendship. The thing about David, Michael said as they talked, is that he represents something I see over and over in emergency services. People who have survived their own crises often become the most effective helpers for others going through similar struggles. Their voices carry an authenticity that can't be taught. It can only be lived. Jimmy nodded, profoundly moved by his conversation with Michael. You've both turned your connection into a force for saving lives. In the weeks following Michael's appearance, something remarkable happened. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline reported a significant increase in calls from people seeking help, many specifically mentioning that they had been inspired by Michael and David's story to reach out for support. Emergency dispatch centers across the country began implementing training programs based on the voice-based intervention techniques that Michael and David had developed together. A year later, Michael published a book co-authored with David, who wrote under a pseudonym to protect his privacy, titled Voices in the Dark: How One Phone Call Changed Everything. The book became a resource for crisis counselors, emergency dispatchers, and anyone who wanted to learn how to be a voice of hope for people in crisis. The book included transcripts of their annual letters to each other, offering readers insight into how their relationship had evolved over 13 years and how their shared experience had shaped their approaches to helping others. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome was the scholarship fund that David established in Michael's name, providing financial support for young people who had survived suicide attempts and wanted to pursue careers in mental health, emergency services, or crisis intervention. That Monday night, when Michael Rodriguez shared his story of being a voice of hope during the darkest hours, he reminded millions of viewers that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply listen, really listen, to someone who needs to be heard. His 20 years of answering emergency calls had taught him that human connection can be a lifeline, that voices can carry hope across any distance, and that sometimes the person on the other end of the line becomes an essential part of the story of survival, healing, and ultimately service to others who need that same voice of hope in their own dark moments.